Hello, I'm Ellen Bosberg, editor of Mutuality Magazine and blog at CBE International. CBE is dedicated to reclaiming God's design for full equality between women and men in the church, home, and our communities. We host thousands of articles on women, men, equality, and the Bible at cbeinternational.org, and all our online resources are free. Today, I am speaking with Kelley Nikondeha, author of Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom, CBE's recent book club pick. Kelley is a liberation theologian with a theological imagination shaped by the Jubilee texts, the Exodus narrative, Isaiah's vision of the new city, and the life of Jesus. She, in partnership with her husband, is a community development practitioner in Burundi. She is the author of Adopted, The Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World, and Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom. She is an adopted person and has adopted her 2 children. She is a Mexican-American woman married to a Burundian man, and she is a California girl at heart. Thank you for joining me today, Kelley. We've really enjoyed reading your book together this summer. It's provided so much food for thought.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So we have a few questions for you today as a wrap up to our book club on Defiant. Some have even been submitted by book club members, so let's dig into them.
Great.
All right. First, a personal question about your faith submitted by a book club member. Mm-hmm. How did you come to know Jesus, and what has been your biggest faith test so far in your life?
Sure. Well, I grew up into the Catholic Church. So in the early days, my parents, they grew up in the Catholic Church. And so I was, a matter of fact, they adopted me through a Catholic adoption agency.
Wow.
And I often think about adoption as a sacrament in terms of how it has functioned in my own life. So I feel like all of the sacraments, my first communion, adoption, my first confession. I mean, so much of that happened, kind of under the wing of Mary in the Catholic Church. So that's really how I came to faith, was through the sacraments and the catechism of the Catholic Church. I know a lot of people struggle with Catholicism, but for me, it was my path to actually knowing and experiencing Jesus. Even the first time that I spoke in tongues and had a charismatic experience was within the Catholic Church. So that is how I came to faith. And I have kind of cycled back into my Catholic roots as an adult. So when it comes to a test of faith, really adopting our children, believe it or not, was a real challenge. My husband and I, for all the things about us that are different, he's from Burundi in East Africa, grew up in extreme poverty. I'm from the California coast, middle class family. In so many ways, we were opposite, except neither one of us wanted to have a family. We just both figured that we would be working together somehow in God's kingdom, kind of going back and forth and with the freedom to serve, unencumbered by family. That was the one thing that we absolutely knew. And somehow the Spirit thought that was too much common ground for us. And so,
right.
Yeah. So when we met my son, we met him when he was about 4 months old, and in Burundi, and the woman who ran the orphanage had mentioned that he needed a family. A lot of the other children, they were just rehabilitating them physically, but he actually needed a family. And I remember the middle of that night, waking up, and I felt so clearly the question, would you make room for him? I was like, I don't want to raise children, and my husband doesn't want to raise children, and you've got to be kidding. But the question kept coming, and it was, I say it was a test of faith because everything that I had known about myself, I had never wanted children, never wanted to be pregnant. And so it was, wow, would I really completely reorient my life to say yes to what I thought was the Spirit's invitation to create a home for him? Would I be willing to lay down what I thought I wanted for the sake of, a question that I felt the Spirit was asking, and so by the time I felt like, yeah, I need to consider this, I remember asking my husband when I finally told him what I had been for the last few weeks struggling through, and we just laughed. But it was like we were in this little room in this little house in Burundi, and we were doubled over in laughter, tears coming down our face. I remember him saying, "But we have kids." I'm like, "I know," and then we'd laugh some more and cry some more. He's like, "But we wanted to pay off our house for," I know. Like, it felt like that Abraham and Sarah moment where we, even though we mentally were not sure that this worked, everything in our body was testifying to the fact that this was the Spirit at work. And I think we knew what the answer was. We knew that the answer was yes, even though it was not at all what we had planned. So that to me was the biggest test, was when God invites you to do something so against the grain, are you willing to relinquish and trust that he's going to, give us what we need to be parents? And so that was it. Our kids are now 16 years old, so we're, many years into this,
Yeah. Wow, what a story. But the Holy Spirit is rarely kidding, and it's
and I know, like
mysterious and scary.
Yes, and some people totally. Oh, sorry, I'm losing my scarf here. Some people totally want families, and that's awesome. But that was just never what we had planned. So,
yeah, well, how exciting. Okay, this next question, also from a book club member, is about your early experiences with racism and misogyny.
Wow, bringing out I was going to say the big guns. I need to be careful with that metaphor these days.
Right, exactly, but it's a heavy one.
Yes.
So what incident or incidents first showed you that there were racists and misogynists in the world? How old were you? Did you tell anybody? Or maybe what were the thoughts and feelings that you internalized? Is there anyone who has been hard for you to forgive because of their racism or misogyny?
Yeah. I wonder if my answers will be dissatisfying, but I grew up maybe like a lot of Americans with a sense of racism, the caricature, the cartoon version, right? Somebody saying a racial slur, somebody wear, the white hood, somebody saying a racist joke or waving a Confederate flag, but for a long time, I think I just thought that's what racism was, which actually is a very juvenile understanding of racism. I didn't actually recognize true racism until I was an adult. I'd say some of that started obviously being married to a man from East Africa. Certainly there were a lot of things that I started to unpack in the context of a bicultural marriage. But I would say that my deeper understanding of racism, and that is where we actually have to recognize that there are structures in society that are designed with racial animus in mind. I didn't encounter that understanding, which to me is the more deeper understanding of racism, until I went to South Africa, which was, back in 2009. And my friends had invited me, and they gave me a reading list before I got there. So I read Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. I read Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness. I read Angie Krog's The Country of My Skull. Lots of reading before I arrived. But, this was just 15 years after apartheid had ended. And I remember seeing and driving into the townships and thinking, I thought we were done with this. I thought this all ended. And then I remember going into some of the schools and hearing teachers talk about the challenges of reforming the Bantu education system, which was a system shaped for the Black and Brown population, and really just educated kids enough to be good servants, but not enough to trouble the waters, not enough to, with critical thinking or problem solving skills or anything that could get, them in trouble. But as I watched both in the school and the township, I started to recognize how the system was designed with, to keep a certain class of people down. And that you just don't untangle that overnight. You don't just have a decree that says that apartheid was wrong and we're done with it and everything's okay. There were still all these deep structures that were going to take decades or generations to undo. The waiting list for better housing for people in the township was 20 years. So 15 years after apartheid, the people who were on the waiting list still had 20 years to wait before they could get out of the township. I mean,
Wow.
And I think there was something about that just allowed me to see what structured racism looks like in a society. And because I was over there, I didn't have any of my own emotional baggage. But when I came home, what happened is I got new eyes and I started to see the ways in which redlining and different things like that in my own country were still having an impact, and what racism, that the racism wasn't something in the past or just some cartoon character, but it actually is this ongoing dynamic, and that I was a beneficiary, and that Kendi would tell us, you're either a racist or you're anti-racist. There's no such thing as being not racist. You're either part of the system and voting for that system and contributing to it and benefiting from it, or you're saying, no, I don't want to be a part of that. I want to be part of dismantling that system. So that's how I came to be aware, I think, of a deeper kind of racism that I'm trying to dismantle as a citizen of this country.
Yeah. What about misogyny? Anything come to mind there?
I was in one sense very fortunate that I had a lot of both men and women in my life, that even though they were part of conservative structures, at some point my parents moved to a conservative, spirit-filled evangelical church, and so a lot of my junior high, high school, college years were in that evangelical space, and it was a very conservative version of that tradition, very complementarian. But even though I grew up in that space, I actually always had leaders who recognized my abilities and always encouraged me. And I never felt that I was precluded from doing something because I was a woman. I could see things around me. I could see that my mom had some limits in what she wasn't allowed to be an elder. She wasn't allowed to stand up front in front of the church. So I could see things, but I never felt it until I got to seminary. So I went to Fuller Theological Seminary in the late 90s, and Fuller fully affirms women and invited women into preaching as well. That's part of what we get to do. And I remember taking my preaching class, and I was the only woman, and the other 11 students were men. And I remember one man on the very first day of class, he was very confident in saying, I have a problem because I don't believe that women are allowed to preach. So I don't think Fuller should be allowing women into this class. And I certainly don't want to have to listen to a woman teach. Like, I don't want to listen to her. And he pointed at me. He goes, I don't want to have to listen to her when it's her turn to preach, because I don't think that that's biblical. And I remember thinking, wow, I had heard about this, but this is the first time I've ever seen it, and it ever came into my orbit. So yeah, seminary was when I was introduced to the fact that there really were people who thought that I shouldn't be able to engage with scripture and break that open and share that with other people. So yeah, the good news is I'm a really good preacher, and I
you sure
I
did.
think yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Isn't that terrible to say? But after our first round of preaching, our instructor asked me if I would lead all the debriefs, because he said, you obviously are, very good at this, and I want you to kind of help me co-lead the class. And boy, that poor gentleman had a very hard time of it.
Yeah. Quite an awakening for him, I'm sure.
So sadly, it was in the church context that I learned about misogyny.
Yeah. I always find stories like yours interesting. Mine is similar. I grew up in a very conservative context, but didn't really experience it until college. Like, then once I declared my biblical languages major, then I started to get questions that were a little askance.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thankfully, there are still leaders in conservative places who affirm and encourage. Yeah.
I agree.
All right. Let's talk more about the book specifically. This question comes from a book club member who was struck by the idea that Jochebed lived on the opposite side of the river from the palace. What made you draw that conclusion, or maybe imagine it in that way?
This is so interesting. I have never imagined it any other way. And I wonder if it was actually something as simple as, in catechism, as I said, at St. Nicholas Catholic Church, I remember sitting in Sunday school and, the teacher, the Sunday school teacher had the book, and there was this beautiful watercolor image of Jochebed down at the river. And it looked like the picture made it look like she was about to push the raft, the ark, across the Nile. And so maybe there is something just as that it was that simple, this early sense from a picture that, of course, she sent him across the river. It wasn't until I was done writing the book and I had asked a few women in my writing group if they would review the manuscript before I submitted it, that one of them happened to say, well, what if she wasn't across the river? What if she was upstream? And I was like, oh, I never thought about that. That's just not where my imagination went. And there really isn't any signaling in the text. It doesn't say that the across or downstream or upstream. There is no directionality in the way that the Hebrew would describe the story. So it actually is kind of open to our own imagination and how we see it when the story is told. I do think, though, because my friend had kind of asked me, well, how do you know? One of the questions was, should I write it in a way that allowed for people to see it either way? I thought, well, there is something to me that happened, that interplay between imagination and theological interpretation, where I was like, well, no, for me, it is across the river. And there is something about these two communities kind of facing off and having to see across to one another, and that Nile River that ran in between them. Like, there was something to me that had a theological import to me in the way that I see the story and then want to be able to tell the story. So I kept it the way that I imagine it, but there actually is nothing in the text that demands that anybody else see it that way. So you could definitely think that maybe the baby just came downstream and maybe they were on the same side of the river. But that's just not how my imagination sees it.
Right. It's interesting to think that, like an early piece of art could have that kind of influence. Yeah.
All of our artists out there, man, you better be deep in the text. Give us some good things to imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as I was reading this book, I identified strongly with Bataya, and many of our book club members did too. We talked a lot about how once we recognize that we are privileged, we need to harness our power to empower others. And in your book, you talk about partnering with those with less power. Right. How do you recommend women make that move from recognizing our privilege to partnering with others? And are there steps we need to take between those 2 points?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think obviously the first step I talk about in the book, and you've already mentioned, which is, recognizing our social location, right? Recognizing where we are in the story. And I've read that story for many, many years, and that never happened. So it's not, we don't want to jump to assume everybody who reads it's going to, immediately figure that out. The first step is actually thinking, oh, where am I in this? What's happening in this story? And then where am I? Where am I in this story, and where am I vis-a-vis my own community? So obviously that's where we start. I think one of the next steps is to really make ourselves available for listening to women from other locations in the story. I think as Americans, maybe even my evangelical brothers and sisters, but definitely as Americans, we want to rush to do something. We want to rush to remedy. We want to rush to save. And yet I think that really when it comes to recognizing where we are, especially if we're like Bethia, if grew up in the courts of Pharaoh, I really think the next step is to take a deep breath and listen. Make ourselves available to hearing things that are hard to hear. I mean, this is one way that I think actually social media can be a really helpful tool for all the things that it doesn't do well. It was a very safe place for me to listen. So when things started happening around the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, I was very intentional about following people on Twitter, activists, Black pastors, women of color who were journalists, etc. Not because I wanted to tell them what I thought, but because it was a way for me to listen into what they were thinking, what they were feeling. And it was a huge education. And the nice thing was I was still able to be anonymous. I didn't get in the way. I didn't demand anything of them. You know, they didn't have to take care of my little fragile white sense of self, but I was able to eavesdrop and hear some things and wrestle with some things. So I think there are ways, you know, that we can get proximate to different communities and be willing to listen and really hear the pain, hear the struggle, hear different ways of seeing a situation and different ways they want to respond to a situation that come from their own upbringing. Even my husband, I mean, golly, being in a bicultural marriage is like having a first class seat to these conversations about seeing the world differently and my assumptions as a white educated American and how different that is from how my husband, who grew up in less than $1 a day, you know, in a little country that most people can't even say and have never heard of, right? Like the ways in which we see, we have to learn to listen. So I would say that would be another next step. If we can get proximate to some of these communities, if some of us live in very white enclaves, or we live with people who are a lot like us, whether they're educated like we are, or they share the same color that we do, or the same socioeconomic class. Sometimes it's being willing to put ourselves in spaces where not everybody is like us, which can be uncomfortable and can be inconvenient. But I think that is also part of being willing to recognize that my location isn't the only location, and sometimes I'm going to have to go if I'm going to learn. But I mean, I met my girlfriend Tahani, who I wrote about in that chapter on Bethia. I met her standing in front of my own elementary school where my kids were having their first day of school. I mean, so some of it is also, can we open our eyes to see that actually there might be people with different stories and different experiences that are around us, but we often don't see them, which is also part of the problem, right? You may not actually recognize that, oh, that woman next to me in her hijab, oh, different story. And so then we were able to start talking, and I felt comfortable enough to approach her and begin a friendship. And so it might be that a lot of the people, you know, who are part of this book group, if we actually started to open our eyes and look a little bit, look with a different perspective, we would realize, oh, you know, I didn't actually recognize, but actually she's Guatemalan, or, oh, there's, you know, I didn't recognize, but they've got some immigrant parents. That means that they have a different story that I can listen to. And so, you know, it really is all about awareness, personal awareness, but also awareness of even the community and neighbors around us, I think. And then we see where the relationships take us, you know. I just don't think we should storm right in and think, well, I'm going to become best friends with somebody, or I'm going to join a group. I mean, I think we need to be willing to ease in ways that where we can kind of educate ourselves gently, and then be open for when the Spirit gives us an invitation, you know, gives us a relationship where we can actually take the next step. Because I think if we do this work, that God is going to be faithful to give us opportunity to create some of those unorthodox partnerships.
Yeah, I think that that word on like just waiting and observing. That kind of like, it's so hard when you do see the problem and you're like, oh, like I want to, you know, that I think that urge is natural to want to fix.
Right.
Or it's at least definitely natural for like my social situation.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Yes,
so,
it's natural.
I'm accustomed to having power. Like I can fix things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So much of our conversation has included our readers talking about ways that they have engaged in working for justice in their lives and the ways that they want to do so more in the future. But sustained engagement in this kind of work can be hard. As someone experienced and invested in long-term justice work, what are your best practices for refreshment and avoiding burnout? Maybe even slowing down, waiting.
Well, I'm going to give the answer that I bet not many people will give, because why not? In our work, we've been doing development work for a little over 12 years now. And I would say that a critical piece of our development work, but also our self-care, is actually doing the work of lament. So lament is, of course, Lamentations, which has become one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's the grief work of the Old Testament, right? The city of Jerusalem has just been destroyed by the Babylonians. The temple has been destroyed. The elite have been taken away in exile, and everybody else is left in the ashes. And it is in the shadow of this destroyed city, a destroyed religious tradition, a whole way of life that has been completely blown apart, like the 9/11 of the Old Testament, that we get the poetry of Lamentations, where they are grieving the loss of life as they knew it. It's not a happy book. It is full of really graphic imagery, really harsh language. As a whole community, not individual, it's not an individual grief. This is a communal, it is the whole community voicing their utter devastation and confusion and loss. And yet we are told that this is also called the book of consolation, that there is some comfort in being able to say honestly what's happening, and honestly what we're feeling about it. And having been in contact with lots of folks who are missionaries or do development work like we do, I find people are always trying to pretend that the ministry's going well, the project's going as we planned. We know God's called us to do this, so we are energized and happy, and and there's a little bit of that American can-do spirit. We can do it. We're pioneers. And yet we've been given Lamentations, a full third of the Psalms, right? This is the prayer book of the Old Testament. A full third isn't praise and thanksgiving, but is lament. That this is part of how we are meant to be honest with one another and with ourselves and with God about a life of faith, and certainly a life of service. So for me, this has been something, my husband and I have just woven it into how we do our work. We weep with those who weep. So in our communities, when we suffer loss, we are with them in the crying and the confusion, not with answers, but just in shared grief, because this is what's wrong. A child's been lost. The marketplace is burnt down, and 70% of the people we bank with have just lost all their income, their business, their inventory. The first thing you do is just weep together at how in the world could this have happened to us, But then even my husband and I, we have to be able to be honest, like, wow, this project is not going the way that we thought. I am really having a hard time in Burundi right now. This is not easy for me, right? The ability to be that honest about ourselves and our work, and how when it doesn't feel holy and it doesn't feel energizing, and we wonder if the Spirit has forgotten that the Spirit invited us into this work. We need to be able to say that. And I think there actually is something very comforting about that kind of honesty, but healing. That, what we find in Isaiah is that when we do lament work, the Spirit comes in and stirs up hope. But it's not like a hope like I just wish things will get better. It's a hope that's rooted in this deep kind of pathos and lament. And so I think when we're that honest, the Spirit comes and generates the newness and energy, the kind that we see in Isaiah 40, right? Where when you're waiting, we think that we're sitting there doing nothing, but actually the Spirit's at work. So I would say lament is one of the things that's been a lifesaver for us. And as I already said, waiting, when we think of that text in Isaiah 40, we think that waiting is sitting and twiddling our thumbs. But in that text, actually, the picture is more like, I love the Olympics, especially the Summer Olympics. So, when you see the runners they all come out on the starting line and they're up on their toes and up on the balls of their feet waiting for the starting gun. That is an active kind of waiting. They are listening, they're leaning in, they're using all the muscles that you're supposed to use when you do a good old plank that I'm not very good at. It's that very active, engaged, my whole body is in, and I'm just waiting to hear the Spirit say, go. And when we wait in that way, they're again pushing against our own tendencies to want to rush in and solve and do and feel better and, take a bubble bath and make ourselves feel great. But when we can do that kind of waiting, the text says that God exchanges energy. The word is exchange, that we get his eternal renewable energy, and he takes the energy that is always exhausted, that always is going to run dry, and he exchanges his energy for ours and gives us the ability to go on to whatever the next leg of the race is. So I'd say lament, that kind of waiting. And the last thing that I would say would be, why did I just lose it? I thought I was thinking. Oh, yeah. This is another one most people don't think about, but I often find interdisciplinary exploration. So my neck of the woods is theology. I do the theological work for our development. So it's good for me to read some cookbooks. It's good for me to take a break and read sociology, or to read a historical narrative, or like to kind of get out of my work mode and put myself in a different space. It can mean going somewhere different instead of just going to places because I'm researching a development strategy or whatnot. Go to Palestine. I mean, that's one of the things we did, went to Palestine and just be in a different place where the language is not our language, the story isn't our story, and yet, let's just see what happens when we allow ourselves to be in a completely different world. It's really refreshing, and it can get you out of the modes of working and solving. And of course, the wonderful thing is often you come back with a fresh perspective that you couldn't have gotten any other way. Some of my best ideas for books have actually come when I've been reading something so far afield, and I'm like, oh, that idea about cooking actually reminds me about this theological thing. Now I know how to connect these ideas. So, never underestimate the power of a really good cookbook.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah, so do a little interdisciplinary exploration. I think it also helps just kind of create some new connections, some new space.
Yeah, thank you. CBE is committed to promoting the biblical message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to serve and lead side by side as equals. And at least one CBE book club member changed her perspective on women in leadership after reading your book. So have you heard of other responses from readers who changed their mind about women leading in the church or the world in new ways from reading your book?
Well, I mean, I've heard of a lot of women who really felt affirmed in what they sensed was there, but had never fully seen. So maybe CBE is already doing so much good work that there was already some really great seeds out there. But I've had women say, oh, I always kind of sensed that there was more than just the Martha and Mary narrative. Of course, we often get that mistold, and that's part of the problem. But I mean, a lot of women have been like, I've always sensed there was more, but they had never found a place where they really saw it. And so I've heard people say, gosh, I just really appreciate being able to see women engaged in freedom work, that was helpful for them. It confirmed what they deeply sensed. And when I started to write the book, that was my thought, was that women need to be able to see that this is already in our scripture. This is already part of our inheritance. We just need to be able to see it, the archetype of these amazing liberative women. I have had a few women, and this has been interesting because, of course, I wrote this book, back in 2016, 2017, 2018, back in there. But I've had a lot of women who have actually read it right about the time that the protests started. So right after the death or the murder of George Floyd. So a lot of women have either I've been in book groups with them, or they've written me emails just saying, I was reading this book as people were on the streets in Minneapolis or wherever. And they felt like the book gave them language for what they were seeing on the streets, which is so interesting because, of course, I didn't write it with that in mind. And yet these things remain so contemporaneous, really, right? The struggle for freedom and justice. But one woman in particular, she had told me that when Ferguson happened, she was very supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, but she was very quiet about it because she wasn't quite sure how other people in her church community would feel. So she said she sent money and she read everything and was very supportive, but quietly. But she read this book, and then George Floyd was murdered. And by this time she had moved to Texas. And she said, just last week I went out and for the first time ever marched in public in a Black Lives Matter protest in my own city. Like she had said that my book helped her feel like theologically it was okay for her to protest for the sake of justice, against police brutality and in support of Black lives. And so it wasn't that she hadn't already had that in her heart, but she just didn't have the confidence that, can I really do this? But somehow she said reading Defiant really gave her permission, that if the Spirit was leading her out onto the streets, that she could go. And so she did. And she said it was so liberating to be able to kind of pray with her feet. And some of the other women have said similar things, that it helped them feel like this was something they could entertain if they felt the Spirit leading them in that direction. And I know the Spirit doesn't lead all of us onto the streets. And so I always want to be careful to say, I want us to be free to answer the Spirit, that whatever God calls us to do, whatever the Spirit is stirring up in us, whether that's protesting or unique, kinds of partnerships or acts of defiance, whatever it is, we have permission to say yes and step into the liberation story.
Yeah, so good word. So one last question.
Okay.
Would you be willing to share with us what your next book project will be about, or maybe what you're currently researching, like a little peek into the future?
Sure. Well, we are I haven't yet signed. I'm waiting for the contract to arrive, and so technically I cannot tell you everything.
Oh, no.
But what I can tell you is that this book is actually going to center deeply on Palestine. I mentioned that I traveled there just on a whim, and I have gone every year since. It has become a place that has been so rich for me. And so I guess no surprise that there would come a book out of that region. But this book will really look at the people, the place, and the politics of Palestine, both the ancient, which of course is anchored in scripture, and the contemporary, which is connected to some of the modern dynamics that we see happening in the region. I mean, the first time I went with a group of women peacemakers. And so we were connecting with men and women who were peacemakers in Israel, Palestine. Some were Muslims, some were Palestinian Christians, some were Messianic Jews, some were Jewish, you know. So we got to meet peacemakers from all different corners of the region. And I remember feeling, do you remember when we used to have cameras with those big, like the big lens? Yes. I mean, now we all do it on our phones, but the sense I had the whole time I was there was that sometimes, you know, you were zooming in and other times you were zooming out. Because sometimes I was looking at the place where Jesus was where we say traditionally Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But then I would zoom out and think it was only a handful of years ago that this was on the news at Christmas because the Church of the Nativity was besieged. And there were big, you know, Israeli tanks outside and there were Palestinians inside. And, you know, like you kind of go back and forth between the text and the ancient stories. And then, oh, and here's a separation wall, you know, and like, oh, but this is the place where Jesus was at the well in Nablus. Oh, but this is in the West Bank and there's a checkpoint between here and Nazareth. Like you kept, it was like that back and forth between the then and the now. And yet so many of the dynamics are deeply similar. So this book will explore some of those Palestine then and now, and hopefully it'll encourage people to think differently about the people that are there and the political realities that both Jesus encountered and that Palestinian Christians there are still encountering and that we encounter too.
Yeah, wow, that sounds like that'll be another eye-opening and transformative book. So very
I hope so. I've been reading the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees all day.
Oh, that's fun. So those are all the questions we have. Okay. Kelley, thank you so much for writing Defiant and for talking more about yourself in the book with me today. I know that we all look forward to reading more of your work in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's been such an honor to have everybody read it with me. So, you know, I've been having this conversation by myself. And so now to have more people reading and to feel like we are in the conversation together and to get questions and to feel like we're all learning together, so energizing. So thank you for inviting more people into that conversation. It's been an honor.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I love book clubs. Like I just want to talk about books with other people. So
me too.
So yeah. Well, thank you, Kelley. We'll see you later.
Okay.